Now, HTML tags, like I said, can be classified in several ways. There is inline versus block. There's empty versus non-empty. An empty tag does not have content. A non-empty tag has content. In other words, something like an image tag that has no content would be empty. Something like a paragraph tag would be non-empty because it almost always has content in it. Logical and physical tags are basically things like strong versus bold, or emphasis versus italic. One of them is logical, the emphasis, and one of them is physical, italic. Physical meaning how it physically looks. Most people prefer the logical tag. It's more appropriate for screen readers, for people with visual disabilities whose web pages are read to them, and those kinds of situations. And here we tend to use the term element and tag interchangeably, but they are technically not the same. So let's take a peek. You can see here a paragraph tag, which is a non-empty tag. It has attributes, it has content, and this whole thing between the opening tag and the closing tag, including the content, this whole thing is considered an element. So as we start talking about pulling out pieces of elements with JavaScript and replacing them and working with them and animating them, doing all sorts of cool stuff with them, you want to sometimes be a little bit precise with your language and what you're referring to so that you can communicate with your other team members and anybody who might be looking at your code. Again, non-empty versus empty, just an example. Non-empty paragraph, empty image. The image does have attributes, but attributes aren't content. Nobody ever sees the attributes. But a paragraph tag has content that will actually visually appear on the page. With CSS, what you need to know: the anatomy of a style. Styles typically have a selector, which is usually pointing to an HTML tag, and they also have a declaration part broken down into properties and values. You will find a lot of parallels between the way HTML and CSS is written with JavaScript. So I hope you're comfortable with CSS. This is going to look very, very familiar to you throughout this course. CSS can be in three places. It can be inline, right beside a tag. It's generally considered poor style to use inline tags, or inline CSS. But it's done, especially when you're manipulating things on the fly. Embedded means your CSS is inside the head section of your HTML page. It's up in the head part of your HTML document. It affects elements on an entire page. Very, very nice for working up style sheets on the fly. And there's external style sheets which allow you to affect a whole website or multiple pages. And it's downloaded once, stored in memory, and has very little overhead. Makes things work a lot faster, and it makes it a lot easier to edit. So, three types of styles, just a visual representation of them. Inline style, good for one tag. Embedded, good for a whole page. And external is good for an entire site. So, some examples of the code for CSS. If you're using an inline style, there you go. Make sure it's in quotes. It's just like a normal property value pair in an attribute. Embedded means you've got a style tag up in the head of your document. And external styles are linked to through the link tag in our external document. And you can generally name those whatever you want. Most of the time, I'll be calling our CSS files main.css. So there you go. A few other details of things you need to know about web pages, DTDs, and a few other little things, and the end of the world as we know it, so to speak. The minimal HTML to create a web page is this: an HTML element with a child of the head, who has a child of title. The sibling to the head, or the child of HTML, would be the body. So you have a HTML tag, you have a head and a body tag, and you have title tag. That's the bare minimum HTML to create a web page. So, there are different flavors of HTML. There's all of these different flavors. Which one to use? Up until now, more than likely, your instructors and you have been using the XHTML 1.0 transitional document type declaration. And it's just the flavor, the version of HTML. However, today, we get tired of writing out all the stuff in the XHTML 1.0 transitional. It's just a lot to remember. A lot can go wrong when you're typing all of that. So HTML5 has simplified things greatly, and it's what we'll use and is much preferred today because it's very, very simple. I mean, look at that. It's one line versus 3. It's very easy to remember and is much preferred. So there you go, HTML5 as DTD, and that's what we'll be using in this course. If you look at where you put your CSS, here is an example of a link tag pointing out to a CSS file. And every file needs to be validated. All your HTML should be validated. Validation is important because if your code is not predictable, then JavaScript and CSS can't point to it, and in the case of CSS, style it. In the case of JavaScript, affect it or exchange it or animate it or do anything that we want to do with it. So you need to check and make sure your code validates. A couple of places you can go and validate your code. There's a validator for HTML at validator.w3.org. There's a way to validate your CSS at the same website, just a slightly different server there. And the w3.org is, of course, the standards-making body for the internet. So that's the golden standard that we're going to use for validation. There are tools to validate your files in Dreamweaver and all the different IDE programs. But what I'm going to do when I check your HTML is run it through the W3 website and grade you accordingly. So that's all you should really know. That's all you're expected to know for this course. See you in the next movie.